My heart was pounding as I stood in the kitchen, the scent of dinner still lingering in the air, when I heard the front door open. I thought it was Brian, coming home from another late night at work, but the footsteps were lighter, more hesitant. It was Mike. His face was pale, his eyes avoiding mine, and I knew something was wrong. I called out to him, but there was no response. As I approached, I saw the turmoil in his eyes, and in that moment, our family's fragile balance teetered on the edge. What happened next would change everything, and now, I'm left wondering if we can ever go back to the way things were. Will our family survive this unexpected turn, or is this the beginning of the end? My name is Alice, and I've been married to Brian for 5 years now. We live in a cozy suburban home, the kind with white picket fences and a garden that blooms in spring. Brian has a son, Mike, from a previous relationship. Mike moved in with us a couple of years ago when he turned 18, looking to start college nearby. He's a quiet kid, always polite, and trying to find his place in our family dynamic. Brian works long hours as a software engineer, often coming home late, tired, but always with a smile for me. I manage a small boutique in town, which keeps me busy, but not as much as Brian. Our life together is comfortable, predictable, and filled with the usual ups and downs of married life. However, recently, things have taken an unexpected turn. It started one evening when Brian was working late again. I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner for Mike and myself, when I heard the front door open. Assuming it was Brian, I called out, "Dinner's almost ready." But there was no response. Curious, I walked into the living room to find Mike, looking somewhat distressed. "Hey, Mike, everything okay?" I asked, noticing his pale face and the way his hands were trembling slightly. "Yeah, just had a rough day," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He sat down on the couch, his gaze fixed on the floor. I sat beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Do you want to talk about it?" Mike hesitated, then began to speak, his words coming out in a rush. "I've been feeling out of place here, Alice. I appreciate everything you and Dad have done for me, but sometimes, I feel like I'm intruding on your life." His confession hit me hard. I had always tried to make him feel welcome, but maybe I hadn't been as successful as I thought. "Mike, you're not intruding. This is your home too. We want you here." He nodded, but his eyes told a different story. "It's just, sometimes I feel like I'm in the way, especially when you and Dad have your moments." I understood what he meant. Brian and I, in our private moments, had perhaps not been as discreet as we should have been. There were times when the heat of the moment led us to forget the thin walls of our home. "I'm sorry if we've made you uncomfortable," I said, feeling a flush of embarrassment. "We'll be more mindful." Mike shook his head. "It's not just that. I see how you two are together, and it makes me miss my mom even more. I feel like I'm missing out on something." His words were like a punch to the gut. Here was this young man, trying to navigate his new life, and I had inadvertently added to his burden. "Mike, I'm so sorry. We never meant to make you feel like that. Your dad and I, we love you, and we want you to feel at home here." He gave me a small, sad smile. "I know, Alice. I just need some time to adjust, I guess." That night, after Mike had gone to bed, I lay awake next to Brian, who had finally come home, exhausted. I watched his chest rise and fall with each breath, thinking about how our little family was changing. The comfort of our routine was being challenged, not just by Mike's presence, but by the unspoken needs and emotions that were surfacing. The next morning, I decided to take a different approach. I suggested to Brian that we should make more of an effort to include Mike in our daily lives, not just as a guest, but as part of our family. Brian, ever the supportive husband, agreed wholeheartedly. We started small. I'd invite Mike to join us for dinner, not just as an afterthought, but as a planned event. We'd ask about his day, his classes, his friends. Brian would share stories from work, making sure to include Mike in the conversation. Slowly, the atmosphere in our home began to shift. One evening, as we sat around the table, Mike laughed at one of Brian's work anecdotes. It was a genuine, carefree laugh, something I hadn't heard from him before. It felt like a breakthrough, a sign that maybe, just maybe, we were beginning to bridge the gap. But as we were making progress, another layer of complexity was added. Brian, in his effort to connect with Mike, started coming home earlier, which meant less time for us alone. Our intimate moments became fewer, and when they did happen, they were rushed, almost secretive, which only added to the tension. I found myself torn between my role as a wife and as a stepmother. The balance was delicate, and I was constantly adjusting, trying to ensure everyone's needs were met, including my own. One night, as Brian and I lay in bed, the silence between us was palpable. "Brian," I whispered, "do you think we're doing enough for Mike?" He turned to face me, his eyes reflecting the moonlight. "I think we're trying, Alice. But maybe we need to try harder. Maybe we need to show him that he's not just staying with us, but he's part of us." His words resonated with me. We needed to redefine our family, to make room for Mike not just physically but emotionally. It was a challenge, but one I was willing to face, for the sake of our family's unity and for the love I had for both Brian and Mike. As I drifted off to sleep, I realized that our life, once so predictable, was now a journey of discovery, of learning to love in new ways, and of finding balance in the unexpected turns our lives had taken. It was a typical Thursday evening. I had just returned from the boutique, my back aching from standing all day. The pain was sharp, radiating down my spine, and I couldn't find relief no matter how I sat or lay down. The house was quiet, save for the faint sound of music coming from Mike's headphones. He was in the living room, engrossed in his studies, his face illuminated by the glow of his laptop screen. I watched him for a moment, his concentration unbroken, and thought perhaps he could help. "Mike, could you do me a favor?" I asked, trying to mask the discomfort in my voice. He looked up, surprised, and I explained about my back. He hesitated for a moment, but then agreed, setting aside his books. Mike approached with a gentle concern in his eyes. "What do you need me to do, Alice?" he asked, his voice soft, almost hesitant. "I was hoping you could help me with a massage," I said, feeling a bit awkward. "I've tried everything, but nothing seems to work." He nodded, his expression serious. "I'll do my best. Where does it hurt the most?" I pointed to the lower part of my back, and he moved behind me, his hands hovering uncertainly before he began. His touch was tentative at first, but as he felt the knots in my muscles, he applied more pressure. It was an odd sensation, having Mike, who was still somewhat a stranger in our home, touching me in such an intimate way. But the relief was immediate, the pain easing under his surprisingly skilled fingers. As he worked, I found myself relaxing, the tension in my body slowly dissipating. "You're good at this," I murmured, surprised by how much better I felt. Mike chuckled lightly, a sound that was becoming more familiar in our home. "I used to help my mom with her back pain," he said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "She always said I had magic hands." The mention of his mother brought a pang of sadness. I knew how much he missed her, how her absence was a silent presence in our lives. "She must have been proud of you," I said, hoping to comfort him. He paused, his hand still on my back, then resumed the massage with a renewed vigor. "She was. And I think she'd be glad to know I'm helping out here." The room fell into a comfortable silence, filled only by the soft music from his headphones, now placed on the coffee table. I could feel the warmth of his hands through my shirt, the steady pressure easing the knots in my muscles. It was a moment of connection, a bridge being built between us, not just through words, but through touch. After a while, Mike stopped, his hands resting gently on my shoulders. "How's that?" he asked, his voice hopeful. "Much better, thank you," I replied, turning to face him with a grateful smile. "You've really helped." He smiled back, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, making him look younger, less burdened. "I'm glad. I want to be useful here, Alice. Not just a guest." "You're not just a guest, Mike," I assured him, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "Your family." And we're here for each other, right? Right, he nodded, his smile widening. As he returned to his studies, I sat there for a moment, reflecting on how our family was evolving. The physical relief from my back pain was one thing, but the emotional relief of seeing Mike more at ease in our home was another. It felt like we were all learning to navigate this new dynamic, finding our places not just in the physical space of our home, but in each other's lives. I stood up, feeling lighter, not just from the massage, but from the sense of progress. I walked over to the kitchen, where I started preparing dinner, thinking about how to further include Mike in our daily routines. Maybe tonight, I'd ask him to help with dinner, or perhaps we could watch a movie together after eating. Small steps, but each one felt significant. As I chopped vegetables, my mind wandered to Brian, who was still at work. I wondered how he'd feel about this new development, about Mike helping me in such a personal way. But then, I remembered his words from last night, his commitment to making Mike feel like he belonged. This was part of that, wasn't it? Building a family, not just maintaining one. The sound of the front door opening pulled me from my thoughts. "Dinner's almost ready," I called out, expecting Brian. But when Mike appeared in the kitchen, his books in hand, I smiled. "I meant you too, Mike. How about you set the table?" He nodded, his face lighting up with the prospect of being involved. As he moved around the kitchen, setting out plates and utensils, I realized that these small acts of inclusion were the threads weaving us closer together. Our family was changing, growing, and in its own way, healing. And as I watched Mike, I felt a surge of hope, not just for him, but for all of us, navigating this unexpected turn in our lives together. Mike's hands were surprisingly gentle as he started to knead the muscles in my lower back. The relief was immediate, and I couldn't help but sigh in contentment. As he continued, the room filled with the soft sounds of his music, creating an almost intimate atmosphere. The massage was supposed to be therapeutic, but as Mike's hands moved with more confidence, something shifted. His touch became less about easing pain and more about exploring. My initial discomfort turned into confusion, then a strange mix of guilt and pleasure. Before I knew it, the line between a massage and something far more personal blurred. I should have stopped it, but I didn't. The moment escalated, and what was meant to be a simple act of kindness turned into an affair. The realization hit me like a cold wave when it was over. Mike, looking as shocked as I felt, quickly left the room. I sat there, my mind racing, my body still tingling from his touch. The silence of the house seemed to amplify my guilt. I knew I had crossed a line, one that could unravel the fragile threads of our family. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just a moment of weakness, a lapse in judgment. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. It was a betrayal, not just of Brian, but of the trust we had all been working so hard to build with Mike. The front door opened, and I heard Brian's voice calling out, "I'm home." My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly straightened my clothes, trying to compose myself. "Hey, honey," I managed to say, my voice sounding too high, too forced. Brian walked into the kitchen, his smile fading as he looked at me. "Everything okay? You look off." I forced a smile, my insides twisting with guilt. "Just a long day at the boutique." "I'm fine, really." He nodded, but his eyes lingered on me, searching. "If you say so." "Mike around?" He's in his room, I think," I replied, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. Brian went to check on Mike, and I used the moment to gather myself. I needed to talk to Mike, to address what had happened, to set things right. But every step towards his room felt like walking through quicksand. When I finally knocked on his door, my heart was pounding. "Mike, can we talk?" He opened the door, his face pale, his eyes avoiding mine. "Yeah, sure." We sat on his bed, the space between us charged with unspoken words. "Mike, what happened? It shouldn't have." "It was a mistake," I started, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I know, Alice. I'm sorry." I didn't mean for it to go that far. It's not just on you, I said, feeling the weight of my own responsibility. We both let it happen. But we need to make sure it doesn't happen again. For the sake of our family, for Brian. Mike looked up then, his eyes filled with a mix of regret and something else, something I couldn't quite place. I care about you, Alice. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I care about you too, Mike. But we have to respect boundaries. This can't happen again. He agreed, and we sat in silence for a moment, the air thick with the gravity of our conversation. As I left his room, I felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief that we had talked, that we had acknowledged the mistake. But dread, because I knew the repercussions could be far-reaching. How would this affect our family? Could we move past this? Dinner that night was quiet, the usual chatter replaced by a palpable tension. Brian, sensing something was off, tried to lighten the mood with stories from work, but even his laughter seemed forced. After dinner, as Brian and I lay in bed, I felt the distance between us, not just physical, but emotional. I wanted to tell him, to confess, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I turned to him, seeking comfort in his presence, hoping that our love could weather this storm. The next day, life resumed its routine, but the undercurrent of what had happened lingered. I watched Mike more closely, noting how he avoided my gaze, how he seemed to retreat into himself. Our interactions were polite, but the ease we had been building was gone, replaced by a careful dance around each other. I knew we had to find a way to heal, not just for our own sakes, but for the family we were trying to build. It was a delicate balance, one that required honesty, forgiveness, and a commitment to move forward. But as I looked at Brian, his face serene in sleep, I wondered if we could ever truly go back to how things were, or if this was the beginning of a new, uncertain chapter in our lives. The next few days were a blur. I avoided Mike, and he seemed to do the same. The house felt different, charged with an unspoken tension. Brian, oblivious to the storm brewing, continued his routine, asking if my back was better. I lied, saying it was, but the truth was, my back was the least of my worries now. I wrestled with guilt, shame, and confusion. Should I tell Brian? How could I even begin to explain? Every time I looked at Mike, I saw not just the stepson, but the secret we shared. The weight of my betrayal was crushing, and I knew I had to make a decision soon. The days stretched on, each one feeling heavier than the last. I found myself watching Mike from a distance, his movements now tinged with a cautiousness that hadn't been there before. He'd slip out early in the morning, perhaps to avoid me, or maybe to find some semblance of normalcy in his college routine. I couldn't tell, and it hurt to think about. Brian, in his usual way, tried to keep the family spirit alive. He'd come home with takeout, suggesting we watch a movie together, but the atmosphere was thick with my guilt. I'd sit there, my mind racing with what-ifs and should-haves, barely tasting the food or following the plot of the film. One evening, as Brian was setting up the DVD player, he glanced at me, his eyes filled with concern. "Alice, you've been distant lately. Is something wrong? Is it work?" I swallowed hard, the lie forming on my tongue. Just tired, Brian. The boutique has been hectic." He nodded, but I could see he wasn't convinced. "Maybe you should take a day off. We could go for a drive, just you and me. Clear your head." The idea of being alone with Brian, away from the house, away from Mike, was both appealing and terrifying. What if I couldn't keep my secret bottled up? What if the truth spilled out in the quiet of our car, with nowhere to run? "I'd like that," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The next day, we drove out to the countryside, the landscape a blur of greens and browns. Brian talked about work, about a new project that had him excited, but I could only nod, my thoughts elsewhere. The guilt was a constant companion, whispering in my ear, urging me to confess. We stopped by a small lake, the water still and reflective. Brian took my hand, leading me to a bench. "This place always helps me think," he said, his voice soft. "Is there something you want to talk about, Alice? You've seemed off." The moment was there, ripe for confession. I looked into his eyes, those eyes that had always seen me, loved me. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I leaned into him, resting my head on his shoulder. I just needed this, Brian. Thank you. He wrapped his arm around me, and we sat there in silence, watching the water. I felt the weight of my secret like a stone in my stomach, but I couldn't bring myself to lift it, to let it go. Back at home, the tension hadn't eased. Mike was in his room when we returned, the door slightly ajar. I paused outside, hearing the faint sound of his music, a melody that now felt like an echo of our shared mistake. The next morning, I woke up early, determined to confront the situation. I found Mike in the kitchen, making coffee. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine for a brief moment, before he looked away. "Mike, we need to talk," I said, my voice firm yet gentle. He nodded, setting down his mug. "I know." We moved to the living room, sitting on opposite ends of the couch. The space between us felt like a chasm. "What happened? It was wrong, Mike. We both know that. But we can't let it destroy what we're trying to build here." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know, Alice. I've been thinking about it a lot. I didn't want to. I didn't mean for it to go that far." "I understand," I said, feeling the truth of his words. "But we need to move forward. For your dad, for us." Mike nodded, his expression one of resolve. "I agree. I want to make this right. I want to be part of this family, not just a visitor." His words gave me a flicker of hope, but the path to healing was uncertain. "We'll work on it, together," I promised, hoping that my voice carried the sincerity I felt. The days that followed were a test of our resolve. I made an effort to be more present, to engage with Mike in a way that was appropriate, to rebuild the trust that had been so carelessly broken. Brian, still unaware, seemed to sense the shift in our dynamics, his attempts to bring us closer more earnest. One evening, as we sat down for dinner, Brian proposed a family game night. "It'll be fun," he said, his eyes bright with the idea. "We could use some fun around here." Mike and I exchanged a look, a silent agreement passing between us. We would try, for Brian, for our family. The game night was awkward at first, the laughter forced, the smiles tentative. But as the evening wore on, something shifted. We found ourselves laughing genuinely, the tension easing, if only for a moment. As I watched Mike and Brian, their laughter mingling, I felt a pang of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other, to the family we were meant to be. But the secret still lingered, a shadow over our happiness, reminding me that the journey was far from over. The nights were the hardest. Lying next to Brian, feeling his warmth, I was haunted by the memory of Mike's touch, by the guilt of my actions. I knew I had to make a choice, to either confess and risk everything or to bury it deep and hope it wouldn't resurface. But as I lay there, the silence of the house enveloping us, I realized that the choice wasn't just about me. It was about all of us, about the family we were trying to build. The decision would shape our future, and I needed to be sure it was the right one. The weight of my secret was a heavy burden, but the thought of losing what we had built was heavier. I knew I had to tread carefully, to find a way to heal without breaking what was already fragile. The next morning, as I watched Brian and Mike share a light-hearted moment over breakfast, I made a silent vow. I would protect this family, even if it meant carrying my guilt alone. But deep down, I knew that true healing would require more than silence. It would require honesty, forgiveness, and a commitment to move forward, together. One evening, after dinner, Brian noticed the palpable tension. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. I couldn't hold it in any longer. With Mike in the next room, I took Brian's hand and led him to our bedroom. "Brian, there's something I need to tell you," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. The words felt like stones in my mouth. I did something terrible." Brian's face grew serious, his eyes searching mine for clues. "What is it, Alice? You can tell me anything." I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the confession pressing down on me. It was a mistake, Brian. A moment of weakness. Mike, he was helping me with a back massage, and things, they got out of hand. Brian's expression shifted from concern to confusion, then to a mix of hurt and disbelief. What do you mean, out of hand? I swallowed hard, the truth bitter on my tongue. It became more than just a massage. We crossed a line, Brian. I'm so sorry. The silence that followed was deafening. Brian's face was a mask of shock, his eyes now distant, processing the betrayal. You and Mike? His voice was low, almost a whisper, as if saying it out loud would make it real. Yes, I admitted, my voice breaking. But it was a mistake, Brian. We both knew it was wrong. We talked about it, and we agreed it would never happen again. Brian stood up, pacing the room, his hands running through his hair. How could you, Alice? How could he? His voice was rising, the pain evident. This is our family, our home. How could you both do this to us? Tears streamed down my face, the guilt overwhelming. I know, Brian. I know I've hurt you, hurt us. But I want to fix this. I want to make it right. He stopped pacing, turning to face me, his eyes red with emotion. How, Alice? How do we fix this? How do we go back to how things were? We can't go back, I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. But we can move forward. We need to talk to Mike, together. We need to understand, to forgive, and to rebuild. Brian looked at me, his gaze intense. And what if I can't forgive, Alice? What if this is too much? I reached for his hand, but he pulled away. Then we'll have to find a new way to be a family. But I believe in us, Brian. I believe in our love, in our commitment to each other and to Mike. He sighed, the fight seeming to drain out of him. I need time, Alice. I need to think. I understand, I whispered, giving him the space he needed. The next morning was tense. Brian had slept on the couch, and the house felt like a battlefield after a war. Mike was already up, his face pale, eyes avoiding mine. Mike, I called softly as he moved to leave the kitchen. He stopped, his back to me. We need to talk, all of us. He nodded, his shoulders slumped, and followed me to the living room where Brian was already sitting, his face unreadable. Mike, sit down, Brian said, his voice calm but firm. Mike sat, his gaze fixed on the floor, his body tense. Alice told me what happened, Brian began, his voice steady but cold. I want to hear it from you. Mike's voice was barely audible. I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't mean for it to go that far. It was a mistake. Brian's jaw clenched. A mistake? That's what you call it. You betrayed my trust, both of you. I know, Mike said, his voice cracking. I feel terrible about it. I want to make it right, to earn back your trust. Brian looked between us, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and sorrow. Trust isn't something you can just earn back with words, Mike. It takes time and actions. Real, honest actions. I interjected, we've agreed it won't happen again. We want to work on this, as a family. Brian stood up, his decision clear in his posture. I need some time alone. I'm going for a walk. He left without another word, the door closing softly behind him. Mike and I sat in silence, the weight of our actions heavy in the air. We need to give him time, I said, more to myself than to Mike. But we also need to show him we're serious about fixing this. Mike nodded, his eyes finally meeting mine. I'll do whatever it takes, Alice. I don't want to lose this family. The days that followed were a test of our resolve. Brian was distant, his interactions with us polite but cold. I focused on making our home a place of healing, ensuring that every meal, every moment was an opportunity to rebuild. Mike, for his part, was diligent, helping around the house, engaging in conversations, trying to bridge the gap he had helped create. One evening, as we sat down for dinner, the atmosphere was still strained. Brian had been quiet, his thoughts his own. But as he looked at us, his expression softened slightly. "I've been thinking," he started, his voice hesitant. "I don't know if I can forget what happened, but I want to try to forgive. For us, for our family." The relief was palpable, though the journey was far from over. We talked, openly and honestly, about our feelings, our fears, and our hopes for the future. It was raw, it was painful, but it was necessary. Slowly, the house began to feel like home again. Brian and I found our way back to each other, our intimacy now marked by a new depth, a shared understanding of fragility and strength. Mike, too, found his place, not just as a son, but as a young man learning from his mistakes, growing into his role in our family. The nights were still hard, the memories of that day haunting me, but with each passing day, the weight of my guilt lessened. We were healing, not just as individuals, but as a family, navigating the unexpected turns our lives had taken, together. The confession was painful, filled with tears and apologies. Brian's face went through a gamut of emotions: shock, hurt, anger, and finally, a deep sadness. He didn't yell, he didn't even raise his voice. Instead, he asked for time to think, to process what I had just revealed. The next few weeks were the hardest of my life. Brian moved out temporarily, needing space to decide our future. Mike, feeling responsible, also moved out to stay with a friend. Our home, once filled with laughter and love, now echoed with silence. The absence of their presence was like a void, a constant reminder of the fracture in our family. I spent those days in a haze of regret and self-reflection. I replayed the moments leading up to the incident over and over in my mind, trying to pinpoint where it all went wrong. The guilt was a heavy cloak, weighing down every step I took. I missed Brian's warmth beside me at night, the sound of his laughter, and even the way he'd leave his coffee mug in the sink, a small annoyance that now felt like a cherished memory. In the quiet, I found myself talking to the empty rooms, as if Brian and Mike could hear me. "I'm so sorry," I'd whisper, hoping somehow my words would reach them, would heal the wounds I had inflicted. Brian's absence was palpable. I'd find myself setting the table for 3, then quickly correcting it to 1. The silence was deafening, and in those moments, I realized how much I had taken for granted. The simple act of sharing a meal, the mundane conversations, the warmth of family, all of it was gone, replaced by an emptiness that seemed to grow with each passing day. I reached out to Brian, sending him messages, not to plead for forgiveness, but to let him know I was here, waiting, willing to do whatever it took to mend what was broken. His responses were brief, polite, but distant, a stark contrast to the intimacy we once shared. Mike, too, was a shadow in my life now. I missed his quiet presence, his earnest attempts to fit into our family. I knew he was struggling with his own guilt, his own sense of displacement. I sent him messages as well, offering support, reminding him that he was still part of this family, that we could heal together. The days turned into weeks, and the silence in our home began to feel like a permanent fixture. I started attending therapy sessions alone, trying to understand my own actions, to find a path to forgiveness, not just from Brian and Mike, but from myself. Then, one evening, Brian came back. He stood in the doorway, his eyes searching mine, looking for something I hoped he could still find. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "I want to try counseling, Alice. I want to see if we can rebuild what was broken." The relief was overwhelming, but I knew it was just the beginning. We started attending sessions together, the air thick with tension at first. The therapist, a kind woman with an understanding gaze, guided us through conversations that were raw, filled with tears, and tentative steps towards forgiveness. In those sessions, we laid bare our souls. Brian expressed his hurt, his sense of betrayal, but also his lingering love for me. I shared my guilt, my regret, and my undying commitment to our family. It was painful, but it was necessary. Mike and I had our own heart-to-heart. He came over one afternoon, his face a mix of resolve and sorrow. We sat in the living room, the space between us filled with unspoken words. I've been thinking a lot, Alice, he began, his voice steady but soft. I want to keep my distance for now, to heal separately. But I want you to know, I'm sorry too. I want to make this right. I nodded, understanding his need for space. I know, Mike. And I want you to know, this home is always yours. We'll be here when you're ready. The story of our family was forever changed, but in the ruins of our past, there was a chance for a new beginning, one built on honesty, pain, and the hope of redemption. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment if you enjoyed this story. This will help us create more engaging stories for you.